The cold was a constant thief. It stole the feeling from her fingers, the warmth from her breath, and the hope from her heart. Ilara scrubbed the flagstones of the border keep's great hall, her knuckles raw and red against the icy stone. The lye soap bit into the cracks in her skin, a familiar stinging pain that was almost a comfort. It was a reminder that she could still feel something other than the deep, gnawing chill that lived in her bones. They called her the siphon, the branded, a curse made flesh. The mark, a swirling knot of black ink scorched into the flesh of her forearm, was a permanent declaration of her worthlessness. It was a punishment for a fire she hadn't meant to start, a power she hadn't known she possessed, a tragedy that had stolen her family and left her an outcast at the age of 8. Her thick leather gloves were a second skin, worn day and night. They were meant to protect others from her, a physical manifestation of her shame. But she knew their true purpose was to remind her, with every chafing movement, of what she was: a monster, a danger, untouchable. The sounds of the keep were a distant hum around her. The clatter of armor, the coarse laughter of guards, the crackle of the hearth she was never allowed to stand too close to. Her world was small, contained within the circle of stone she was currently scrubbing. Head down, shoulders hunched, invisible. It was the only way to survive. A sudden silence fell over the hall, so abrupt and heavy it was like a physical weight. Ilara didn't dare look up. Silence was never a good thing. It meant a lord had entered. It meant punishment was about to be meted out. It meant she needed to make herself even smaller. But this silence was different. It was laced with a palpable fear, a cold that had nothing to do with the northern winds rattling the shutters. It was a predatory stillness. The hearth fire seemed to shrink, its flames pulling back as if in terror. She heard the heavy tread of boots on stone, slow and deliberate. Each step echoed with an authority that vibrated through the floor and up into her aching knees. A shadow fell over her, vast and consuming, eclipsing the weak morning light. Get up. The voice was not a command. It was a statement of fact, deep and resonant as a glacier calving into a frozen sea. It was a voice that expected absolute obedience. Ilara flinched, her heart hammering against her ribs. She kept her eyes fixed on the soapy water, on the gray slurry of dirt and lye. Looking up was an invitation for cruelty. I will not repeat myself. The cold intensified, pressing in on her. It was a living thing, an aura of absolute zero that emanated from the figure standing over her. Slowly, trembling, she pushed herself to her feet. She kept her head bowed, her gaze locked on the worn tips of her boots. She could feel the eyes of every guard, every servant, every noble in the hall fixed upon her. Their scorn was a familiar cloak, but now it was threaded with a new, sharper emotion: terror. Not for her, but because of the man who had singled her out. The Alpha King. She knew of him, of course. Kaelin, the Frost King. A ruler of immense power, ancient and feared. Legend said he had winter in his veins, that his heart was a shard of ice. They said he had never taken a mate, for no warmth could survive his touch. His visit to this remote border keep was an unexpected terror, and she had been foolish to think she could remain invisible. A hand entered her field of vision. It was large, encased in a black leather glove, but even through the material she could feel the impossible cold. It tilted her chin up, forcing her to meet his gaze. Everything she had ever heard about him was an understatement. He was brutally beautiful, his face carved from granite and moonlight. High cheekbones, a strong jaw, and a mouth that looked as if it had never known how to smile. But his eyes were the color of a winter sky just before a blizzard, a pale, piercing silver gray that seemed to look past her skin, past her bones, and into the broken, frightened thing that was her soul. He saw the brand. His gaze dropped to her arm, where the edge of the black ink peeked from beneath her glove. She braced for the disgust, the immediate recoil. It was the reaction she always received. But he didn't recoil. A flicker of something unreadable crossed his face. Not disgust, not pity. Something else entirely. Recognition. "Lord Valerius," the king said, his voice dropping to a near whisper, yet it carried to every corner of the silent hall. The keep's master, a cruel and corpulent man, scurried forward. "Your Majesty," Valerius stammered, bowing low, "forgive this creature. She is a branded siphon, a servant of the lowest order. A mistake. She will be punished for being in your sight." King Kalen did not look away from Alara. His silver eyes held hers, a captive audience to his power. "She is no mistake." He released her chin, the absence of his touch leaving a phantom chill on her skin. He turned his head slightly, addressing the trembling lord without honoring him with his gaze. "You have kept something of mine." Confusion rippled through the hall. Alara's own mind went blank with shock. His? What could he possibly mean? "Your Majesty, I don't understand," Valerius whimpered. "You do not need to understand," the king stated simply. He looked back at Alara, his expression unchanging, a mask of frozen control. "This one, she comes with me." The words hung in the air, sharp and glittering as icicles. "She comes with me." It wasn't a request. It was the claiming of property. Alara felt the floor tilt beneath her feet. Fear, stark and absolute, warred with a dizzying, impossible flicker of something else. Something she hadn't felt in over a decade. Hope. The journey to the capital was a blur of snow-choked forests and biting winds. Alara rode in an enclosed carriage, alone. The king rode ahead on a massive black warhorse, a solitary figure against the endless white landscape. She watched him through the small window, a man who seemed more a part of the winter than a traveler passing through it. He never seemed to feel the cold that seeped through the carriage walls and settled deep in her marrow. His citadel was a spike of black stone and ice thrusting into the sky, a fortress carved from a mountain peak. It was a place of breathtaking, terrifying beauty. It was a palace made of winter's heart. As she was led through its vast, echoing halls, she felt the cold intensify. It radiated from the very walls, a permanent, ancient frost that the roaring fires in every hearth could not touch. She was given chambers larger than any room she had ever been in, furnished with dark wood and heavy furs. A bath was drawn for her, and new clothes were laid out. A simple but warm woolen dress of deep gray. No one spoke to her. The servants moved with a silent, fearful efficiency, their eyes skittering away from hers, from the brand on her arm. She was a ghost in a palace of ice. That evening, he came. He entered her chambers without knocking, his presence immediately sucking the warmth from the room. He stood by the fire, his broad shoulders blocking its meager heat. He had shed his heavy traveling leathers for a simple black tunic and trousers. He looked less like a king and more like a predator in his own domain. "You are wondering why you are here," he said. It wasn't a question. Alara swallowed, her throat dry. She could only nod, her hands twisting in the fabric of her new dress. He turned from the fire, his silver eyes pinning her in place. "That mark on your arm, they call you a siphon. They say you draw the heat from the world." "It was an accident," she whispered, the words rusty from disuse. "I was a child. I didn't know." "I know," he said, and the simple statement silenced her. What they call a curse is simply a power they do not understand, a fire without a hearth, uncontrolled, wild. He took a step closer. She fought the urge to shrink away. "I too have a curse, or a power. The distinction has become meaningless over the centuries." He held up his hand. She watched, mesmerized, as a delicate tracery of frost bloomed across the back of his leather glove, sparkling in the firelight. My blood runs with winter. My power is ice. It preserves me, makes me strong, but it is also consuming me. His voice was a low monotone, devoid of self-pity, a recitation of a long-accepted fact. The cold builds. Year by year it grows stronger. I must constantly fight to keep it from freezing me from the inside out. Soon, the fight will be lost. Ilara stared at him, at this impossibly powerful man, and for the first time saw not a king, but a prisoner. A man locked in a cage of his own making. "You believe I can help," she breathed, the realization dawning. My fire. Fire and ice," he said, his gaze intense. "The oldest balance. I saw it in you the moment I laid eyes on you. A furnace banked low, choked with ash and fear, but a furnace nonetheless." He laid out the terms of their arrangement with the cold precision of a general planning a campaign. She was not a guest, not a prisoner. She was a potential solution, a tool. She would live in the palace, be given whatever she needed. In return, she would exist. Her presence, her latent heat, might be enough to slow the advance of his inner frost. "There are rules," he continued, his voice hardening. "You will not speak of this to anyone. You will not leave these chambers without my permission, and you will not, under any circumstances, touch me." The final command was delivered with an edge of absolute steel. "My control is precise, but a single touch of bare skin could freeze you solid. Do you understand?" She understood the words, but the implication was a chasm she couldn't cross. He was so powerful, he was lethal. He was so alone he had to warn people away from his very skin. "Yes, Your Majesty," she whispered. He nodded, a sharp, decisive movement. "That is all." He turned to leave. "Wait," she said, the word escaping before she could stop it. He paused at the door, his back to her. "Why?" she asked, her voice trembling. "Why me? There must be others with fire." He was silent for a long moment. When he finally spoke, his voice was different, softer, almost strained. "There are none. I have searched for centuries." He glanced back over his shoulder, and in his eyes, she saw a flicker of something that looked devastatingly like loneliness. "There has only ever been you." Then he was gone, leaving her alone in the sudden, crushing silence, the room feeling colder than it had before he arrived. The days that followed were a study in quiet observation. Ilara remained in her chambers, a gilded cage where she was fed, clothed, and utterly isolated. The king did not visit again. She saw him only from her window, a distant figure crossing the training yards, his movements fluid and deadly, or a silhouette in a high tower, staring out at his frozen kingdom. The boundary he had set was absolute, and yet intimacy crept in through the cracks. One night she woke shivering, the cold of the castle having finally breached her cocoon of furs. She found a new blanket at the foot of her bed, a magnificent pelt of a snow bear, impossibly thick and warm. It hadn't been there when she went to sleep. There was no scent on it, but the faint, clean smell of winter that clung to him. Another time, granted a moment in the vast, silent library, she found a book left open on a table. It was a history of the first mages, its pages detailing the ancient balance of elemental powers. A passage about fire wielders was underlined with a faint silvery line, as if traced by a frosted fingertip. She began to see past the mask of the Frost King. She saw the man who read histories alone in the dead of night. The man who ensured his strange branded ward was warm. The man who carried the weight of a kingdom and a curse on his broad shoulders. One afternoon, he summoned her. She was led not to the throne room, but to a vast glass-domed chamber at the top of the highest spire. It was a menagerie, but not for animals. It was for his wolf. He stood in the center of the room, and beside him was a beast of impossible size. A wolf as black as a starless night, with shoulders as broad as a bull's and paws the size of dinner plates. Its eyes were the same silver gray as the king's, intelligent and ancient. But it was the thing on its head that made her gasp. An iron muzzle, complex and cruel, was locked over the wolf's powerful jaws. It was not a simple restraint. It was a cage of thick, black iron bars and plates, with a heavy lock beneath the chin. Frost clung to the metal, and with every puff of the wolf's breath, a cloud of icy vapor escaped the grate. "My other half," Kalen said, his voice quiet. He stood beside the beast, his hand resting on the thick fur of its neck. "When the curse is strong, it manifests more powerfully in this form. My breath can freeze a man's heart in his chest from 10 paces. He looked at her, his expression grim. "The muzzle is a necessity. It contains the worst of it. It has not been removed in years." Ilara stared at the wolf. It met her gaze without aggression. There was a deep, weary sadness in its silver eyes, a resignation to its cold prison. She saw the way the frozen metal bit into the fur around its snout, the way it held its magnificent head low. "Does it hurt?" she whispered, the question for the man and the beast. Kalen's jaw tightened. "It is uncomfortable." A masterful understatement. She could see the truth in the wolf's eyes. It was agony. She took a hesitant step forward. The wolf did not move, did not growl. It simply watched her. The air around it was frigid, a bubble of pure winter. "I am showing you this so you understand the stakes," Kalen said, his voice a low warning. "So you understand the boundary. This is what I am fighting. This is what I must control." She saw the truth then. The nightly visits that had become a silent ritual, he would stand in her doorway for a few moments before retiring, as if her mere presence was a balm, were not just for his benefit. He was checking on her. The books, the blankets, they were small gestures of care from a man who had forgotten how to give them. He was beginning to see past her brand, past her damage, and see the woman beneath. And she, in turn, was seeing the lonely, burdened soul inside the Frost King. The unspoken arrangement was fraying at the edges. The clinical distance was dissolving into something fragile and terrifyingly real. Not everyone saw this fragile connection as a thing of hope. Lord Valerius, the former master of her border keep, had been a part of the king's council for years. He was a man who thrived on proximity to power, a sycophant with the eyes of a viper. He had been horrified when Kalen claimed Ilara, but he had hidden it well. Now, in the heart of the citadel, his resentment festered. He saw Ilara not as a cure, but as a rival. A wild card that threatened the careful web of influence he had spent decades weaving around the cold, isolated king. He began his campaign subtly. A whispered word in the ear of a courtier about the dangers of a siphon so close to the throne. A forgotten, historical text left in the council chambers, detailing how fire-wielders had once burned kingdoms to ash. He cultivated an atmosphere of fear and suspicion around her. Ilara felt it in the way the servants now flinched if she came too near, the way the guards stiffened when she passed. The whispers followed her like a miasma, branded, unclean, dangerous. It was a return to the life she thought she had escaped, and her old self-doubts came roaring back. Was the king wrong? Was she truly just a monster he was foolishly trying to tame? Valerius sought her out one day in the library. She was trying to read, but the words swam before her eyes. He approached with a smile that was all teeth, a mask of paternal concern. "My dear child," he began, his voice slick with false sympathy, "I worry for you." Ilara said nothing, merely clutching her book tighter. "The king, he is a desperate man. Valerius continued, lowering his voice conspiratorially. He latches onto any glimmer of hope. But you must know, this will not end well for you. When he realizes you cannot truly help him, that your affliction is nothing more than a parlor trick, he will cast you aside. And his disappointment will be a terrible thing to behold. Every word was a carefully aimed dart, striking at the heart of her deepest fears, that she was worthless, that she was a fraud, that this fragile sense of belonging was an illusion. He is not like that, she managed to say, her voice thin. Valerius chuckled, a low, unpleasant sound. You see the man he wants you to see. I see the centuries of cold, the ruthless pragmatism. He is using you, Ilara. You are a tool, and tools, when they break, are discarded. His poison worked its way into her thoughts. She began to doubt. When Kalen left the warm blanket, was it care, or was he merely preserving his potential cure? When he left the book, was it a connection or a command to study? Valerius escalated his plan. He convinced the council that Ilara's power needed to be tested, to be quantified. For the king's safety, he argued, his face a mask of loyal concern. Kalen, seeing the logic and perhaps wanting to prove her worth to his skeptical court, reluctantly agreed. They took her to a deep, stone chamber, a place used for training battle mages centuries ago. In the center was a block of ice, hauled from the deep glaciers. The test was simple. She was to melt it. Ilara stood before the block, the eyes of the council on her. Valerius stood beside the king, a smug, knowing look on his face. She took off her gloves, her hands trembling. She had never tried to call her power, only ever to suppress it. She placed her hands on the ice. She closed her eyes, searching for the warmth she knew lived inside her, the furnace Kalen had spoken of. She found only a flicker, a tiny, terrified ember. She pushed. Nothing. The ice remained solid, its cold biting at her palms. Laughter, low and cruel, rippled through the assembled lords. Valerius smiled. It seems the siphon's power is a myth, he declared loudly, a tragic delusion. Humiliation burned in Ilara's cheeks. She felt Kalen's disappointment like a physical blow, even though he had not moved, had not spoken. She had failed him. She was worthless after all. Rage and shame warred within her. A memory surfaced. A burning barn, screams, the smell of smoke, the terror of that day, the power that had lashed out uncontrollably. Fear choked her. She pulled her hands back. But in that moment of emotional turmoil, something sparked. A sudden, violent pulse of heat erupted from her palms. It wasn't a gentle warmth. It was a flash of raw, untamed fire. The ice block didn't melt. It exploded. Shards of ice flew through the air like shrapnel. The lords cried out, stumbling back. A large piece spun towards Kalen. Before anyone could react, he raised a hand, and a wall of shimmering, solid air appeared before him, deflecting the shard. It shattered harmlessly against the invisible barrier. Silence descended. Ilara stared at her hands, horrified. She had lost control. She had proven them all right. She was dangerous. "There!" Valerius shouted, pointing a triumphant finger at her. "You see? Uncontrolled. A menace. She could have killed the king." But Kalen was not looking at the shattered ice. He was looking at her, and his silver eyes were not filled with anger or fear. They were blazing with a fierce, brilliant light. He strode forward, ignoring the protests of his council. He stopped in front of her, his presence a wall of cold certainty. He looked down at her trembling hands, then met her terrified gaze. "It is not a myth," he said, his voice low but carrying absolute authority. He turned to face the stunned council, his gaze sweeping over them like a winter storm. "It is a power that has been caged, and I will not see it mocked." He turned back to Ilara, his voice softening just for her. "Come. This farce is over." He turned and walked from the chamber, expecting her to follow. And as she did, she saw the look on Valerius's face, a mask of pure, murderous hatred. He had failed to discredit her, and in doing so, had revealed his own hand. The threat was no longer just whispers and doubts. It was a man in the heart of their world who would see her destroyed, and the king with her if he stood in the way. The winter deepened outside the citadel, a mirror of the growing chill within its walls. The king's defense of her had solidified the battle lines. The court was divided, Valerius and his faction growing bolder in their opposition, while a few others watched Alara with a new, hesitant respect. Kaelin withdrew even further into himself. The public failure of the test, followed by its violent success, seemed to have taken a toll. He spent more time in the menagerie with his wolf, or in the frozen silence of the throne room. The cold radiating from him grew more potent, the frost on his gloves more pronounced. Alara knew, with a certainty that terrified her, that his control was slipping. The internal winter was winning. One evening, a blizzard descended upon the mountain. It was a storm of supernatural fury, winds howling like damned souls, snow so thick it seemed the world had been swallowed by a white void. The very stones of the citadel groaned under the assault. Alara was in her chambers, staring into the fire, when a tremor ran through the castle. It wasn't from the storm. It was a deep, resonant pulse of power, a wave of absolute cold that extinguished the candles and made the fire in her hearth shrink to a few blue embers. Her heart seized. Kaelin. She threw open her door and ran. The corridors were dark and impossibly cold, the tapestries stiff with frost. Servants and guards were huddled in doorways, their faces pale with fear. They stared at her as she passed, a lone figure running towards the source of the terrifying cold. The throne room doors were frozen shut, coated in a thick layer of ice. She could feel the power radiating from within, a raw, untamed blizzard that had been unleashed. She placed her hands on the ice, and for the first time did not flinch from the surge of warmth that answered her fear. The ice hissed and melted under her touch, and she shoved the heavy doors open. The scene within stole the air from her lungs. The vast chamber was a cavern of ice. Frost coated every surface, hanging in great glittering chandeliers from the ceiling. The guards who had been on duty were frozen in place, statues of agony, their faces etched with shock. In the center of the room, on the dais where the throne sat, was the source. Kaelin was on his knees, but he was no longer a man. His great black wolf form was slumped against the throne, and from it poured a torrent of killing cold. The iron muzzle was still locked in place, but it was failing. Frost billowed from the grate like smoke, and the metal was white with a layer of ice so thick it seemed to have become part of the beast. Ice was spreading from his paws, encasing the dais, creeping down the steps, freezing the very stone of his castle. His silver eyes were open, but they were clouded, the light within them fading. He was lost in the storm of his own power, the curse finally overwhelming him. He was dying. The doors behind her burst open. Lord Valerius swept in, flanked by his own contingent of loyal guards. He took in the scene with a look of grim triumph. "It is as I feared," he announced, his voice ringing with false sorrow. "The king is lost. The curse has claimed him. He is a danger to us all." He drew his sword, its polished steel gleaming in the frosty air. He must be put down, for the good of the kingdom. His guards advanced, their swords drawn. Alara moved without thinking, planting herself at the bottom of the dais, between them and the dying king. "No," she said, her voice shaking but firm. Valerius sneered. "Step aside, Siphon. This does not concern you. Your experiment has failed." "You will not touch him," she said, her voice rising, gaining a strength she didn't know she possessed. She spread her arms, shielding the path to Kaelin's frozen form. "Do not be a fool," Valerius snarled, losing his patience. "He is already dead. That is just a shell of ice and fury. Seize her." The guards hesitated, their eyes on the waves of cold pouring from the wolf. They were afraid, but Valerius was more terrifying. They began to advance. Ilara felt a despair so profound it threatened to shatter her. It was over. He was going to die, and she was powerless to stop it. She looked up at the great dying wolf, at the agony in his fading eyes, at the cruel, frozen cage on his face. He had been alone for centuries, and now he would die alone, imprisoned in ice and iron. No. A single word, a silent scream in her soul. She would not let it end this way. She turned her back on Valerius and his men. She walked up the frozen steps of the dais, each step an act of defiance. The cold was a physical thing, a wall of razor blades that sliced at her skin. Her dress began to stiffen with frost. Her breath crystallized in front of her face. It felt as if her blood was turning to slush in her veins. The guards stopped, watching in stunned silence. Even Valerius was frozen in place by the sheer audacity of her actions. She reached the wolf. He was so still, only the faint tremor of the cold pouring from him proved he was still alive. She reached out a trembling hand, her glove doing little to shield her from the searing frost. She touched his shoulder. The cold was so intense, it was like being burned. Through the pain, she felt it. A flicker of his consciousness deep inside the storm. A spark of recognition. A silent plea. Her gaze fell upon the muzzle. The iron was no longer black. It was white, caked in layers of supernatural ice, fused to the fur and flesh beneath. She saw the pain it was causing him, a constant grinding agony on top of the curse that was killing him. He had told her never to touch him. He had warned her about the muzzle. But his rules were for a world where he was in control. That world was gone. She ripped off her gloves, throwing them to the frozen floor. She ignored the gasps from below. Her hands, pale and scarred, felt the brutal cold of the air. She knelt before the great wolf's head. She looked into his eyes, trying to pour all of her will, all of her desperate, unspoken feelings into that one look. "I am here. You are not alone." Then she placed her bare hands on the frozen iron lock of the muzzle. The pain was immediate and absolute. It was a scream of 1,000 frozen needles driving into her palms. The flesh of her hands flash froze to the metal, the cold shooting up her arms, aiming for her heart. Black spots danced in her vision. This was it. This was how she would die, frozen to the man she was trying to save. But beneath the agony, something else stirred. The ember she had struggled to find in the testing chamber, the one that had flickered and died, now felt the killing frost. It did not shrink from it. It roared in defiance, a refusal to let him go. A love she hadn't even dared name. A protective rage against the ice, against the iron, against the man who would dare to strike him when he was down. It was the trigger. Fire erupted from her hands. It was not the wild, destructive flash from before. This was a wave of pure, liquid gold light, a controlled and focused heat that poured from her palms. It was the warmth of 1,000 sunrises, the heat of a forge fire, the gentle glow of a hearth. The brand on her arm blazed, the black, ugly lines of the curse turning into a radiant, swirling sigil of golden light. The ice on the muzzle did not just melt, it vaporized with a deafening hiss. The frozen iron lock glowed cherry red, then orange, then white. The metal softened, groaned, and with a sound like a breaking chain, the lock shattered. Ilara pulled. The muzzle came away in her hands, no longer a cage but a twisted piece of molten metal. She threw it aside, where it clattered against the icy floor. For the first time in years, the king's wolf was free. He took a great, shuddering breath, and for a moment she feared a blast of frost would erupt from him. But the golden light from her hands did not stop. It flowed from her, over him, a tide of warmth pushing back the endless winter. The frost on his fur receded. The ice covering the dais began to crack and groan. The killing cold in the room lessened, replaced by a gentle, impossible warmth. The wolf's head lifted. His silver eyes, now clear and sharp, found hers. The weary sadness was gone, replaced by a raw, staggering awe. Slowly, with a grace that defied his massive size, he began to change. The black fur receded, the powerful form shifting and coalescing. In moments, Kalen the man knelt where the wolf had been. He was pale, weakened, but he was whole. The killing frost was gone from his eyes. He looked at her hands, which were still glowing with a soft golden light. He looked at the brand on her arm, no longer a mark of shame, but a thing of beauty and power. Ilara, he breathed, his voice rough with disuse. Behind them, on the floor of the throne room, Lord Valerius stared, his face a mask of disbelief and terror. Impossible, he whispered. Kalen's head snapped up. His silver eyes, now clear and cold as a winter dawn, pinned the traitor in place. He didn't need to raise his voice. The sheer, focused power in his gaze was enough. Guards, he said, and the two men who had been frozen solid now thawed with a groan, stumbling forward, their loyalty immediately returning. Take Lord Valerius to the deepest cell. He will await my judgment. Valerius didn't fight. He simply stared, defeated, as he was dragged away, his ambitions turned to ash by a power he could never have comprehended. The throne room was silent again, save for the drip of melting ice. Kalen turned back to Ilara. He slowly, hesitantly, reached out and took her hands in his. She braced for the cold, but his skin was merely cool, like stone on a spring morning. The lethal frost was gone. He looked down at their joined hands, her skin glowing, his pale and traced with faint blue veins. I was wrong, he said, his voice thick with emotion. I was a fool. You were dying, she whispered, the light from her hands slowly fading as her panic subsided. I was afraid, he corrected her, his grip tightening. Not of the curse. I accepted that fate long ago. I was afraid of this. Of you. Of pulling you into my end. He finally met her eyes, and the raw vulnerability there shattered the last of her defenses. I set rules to keep you safe from me, but I was the one who needed saving. He lifted her hand, the one with the glowing mark, and brushed his lips against her knuckles. The touch was electric, a meeting of cool and warm, of winter and summer. You were never a curse, he whispered against her skin. You were the cure. Tears she didn't know she was holding welled in her eyes and traced hot paths down her cold cheeks. He gently wiped them away with his thumb. The brand, she said, her voice catching. They marked me as a monster. They marked you for what they could not understand, he said softly. Let me give you a mark they will all understand. He held her arm, his gaze on the now golden sigil. He lowered his head and touched his lips to the mark. A gentle warmth spread from his touch, meeting the fire in her skin. It was not a kiss of passion, but of reverence, of acceptance. When he pulled back, a faint silvery tracing of a crown had appeared, interwoven with the gold of her own power. The royal crest. She was no longer the branded. She was his. And he, finally, was hers. The love she hadn't dared to name, he spoke with his eyes, with his touch, with the heat of his breath against her skin. In the heart of a thawing castle, two souls, once broken and alone, became whole. 3 months passed. Spring came to the northern lands, a season the kingdom had not truly felt in centuries. The snows receded from the lower slopes of the mountain, and for the first time in living memory, green shoots pushed their way through the thawing earth in the citadel's courtyards. Alara stood on a high balcony overlooking one such courtyard. Where once there had been only snow and ice-scoured rock, there was now a garden, vibrant with new life. She had coaxed it from the frozen ground, her gentle, controlled warmth nurturing the dormant seeds. The people of the castle, who had once feared her, now called her the Fire Queen, the Sunheart. They came to her not with scorn, but with reverence. The brand on her arm was a thing of beauty, the golden fire and silver crown a testament to her true nature. She no longer wore the gloves. Her hands were her own again. A pair of strong arms wrapped around her from behind, and a familiar, comforting coolness pressed against her back. Kalen rested his chin on her shoulder, his breath warm against her ear. "My queen is working miracles again," he murmured, his voice a low rumble that vibrated through her. She smiled, leaning back into his embrace. The earth just needed a little encouragement. "As did I," he said softly. His touch was no longer dangerous, but it would always be cool. Her touch was no longer a weapon, but it would always be warm. They were a perfect balance, two halves of a whole. Lord Valerius had been exiled to the very border keep where Alara had once scrubbed floors, stripped of his titles and power, a fitting end for a man who saw people only as tools. The kingdom, under the joint rule of its Frost King and Fire Queen, was beginning to thrive. The fear that had coated everything like a thin sheet of ice was finally melting away. Kalen turned her in his arms, his silver eyes soft and full of a love that still, sometimes, took her breath away. The harsh lines of his face had softened. The perpetual winter in his soul had given way to a gentle autumn. He was still powerful, still a king, but he was no longer alone. "I spent centuries believing my power was a cage," he said, tucking a loose strand of her hair behind her ear. "That to love, to touch, was to destroy." "And now?" she whispered. He smiled, a true, breathtaking smile that was like the sun breaking through winter clouds. "Now I know that my power was just incomplete. It was waiting for its other half." He leaned in and kissed her, a slow, tender kiss that spoke of promises kept and a future filled with warmth. It was a kiss of balance, of homecoming. She was no longer worthless, invisible, or abused. She was a queen, loved and powerful, the heart of her king and her kingdom. And he, the feared Frost King, the muzzled beast, was finally, truly free. Together, they watched the sun set over their new world, a world where fire and ice did not destroy each other, but created a perfect, enduring peace.